Computex 2026 Live, every update and announcement from day one in Taipei. This result is already changing real workflows. Watch how execution details, not headline claims, decide who wins from here. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. What happened in the next 6 hours will reshape how processors get built, how AI models run, and which companies control the next decade of computing. Here's what changed. Computex isn't hype theater. It's where the hardware roadmap becomes real. When TSMC, Nvidia, Intel, AMD, and MediaTek walk on that stage in Taipei, they're not announcing products for next year, they're showing the silicon that'll power every device in your pocket, every data center, and every enterprise workload for the next 5 years. Day 1 revealed 3 shifts that matter more than the headlines suggest. First, the AI chip wars just got personal. Every company on that stage is now racing to prove their silicon can run the next generation of large language models faster and cheaper than Nvidia's stack. That matters because Nvidia's H100 and H200 have owned enterprise AI for 2 years. If you're running GPT-4 workloads, you're renting Nvidia's silicon. But Computex Day 1 showed that Intel, AMD, and custom silicon from cloud providers are closing that gap faster than anyone expected. We saw announcements around new GPU architectures, improved memory bandwidth, and power efficiency numbers that directly challenge Nvidia's margin structure. For investors in Nvidia, this is the moment to watch how they respond. For enterprises, this is the first real alternative path to GPU monopoly pricing. Second, Taiwan's geopolitical leverage just became undeniable. TSMC's process node roadmap, the one announced at Computex, determines which country owns the next 5 years of chip manufacturing. Every advanced node from TSMC, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, and beyond, requires not just billions in capex but also compliance with U.S. export controls, Taiwan's sovereignty, and China's economic pressure all at once. That's not a product announcement. That's a geopolitical flashpoint. The moment TSMC shows they can scale production faster than anyone else, the U.S. government, China, and Taiwan's government all move. This matters if you care about supply chain resilience, tariff policy, or where your portfolio's semiconductor exposure sits. Third, the efficiency race is over. Power consumption per AI inference just became the metric that matters most. Data center operators don't care about raw speed anymore, they care about how many queries they can run per watt. Why? Because every large language model running in a data center costs somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 per day to operate. If you can cut energy use by 30%, you cut inference cost by 30%. That's not a feature improvement, that's a fundamental shift in how AI economics work. Companies that solve this first get to deploy models that competitors can't afford to run. That changes customer pricing, market share, and the entire AI hosting landscape. Now, here's what nobody's talking about yet, the India angle. Indian IT services, cloud providers like Jio, and startups building AI models locally are all waiting for this silicon to hit market at scale. Because the chip announcements at Computex determine the cost at which Indian developers can afford to train and deploy models. If TSMC delivers better power efficiency, Indian data centers pay less per query. If AMD or Intel break Nvidia's grip on enterprise AI, Indian cloud providers can offer competitive pricing to customers who'd otherwise be locked into Nvidia's ecosystem. That directly impacts rupee economics for startups and IT services firms. The students in IIT labs trying to build AI products. They're watching this stage because the silicon costs announced today determine what they can afford to prototype in the next 6 months. Here's what to monitor over the next 48 hours. 1. Which announcements get VC and enterprise interest first, that signals where the real adoption will happen. 2. Which chip is actually available to order before Q3 2026, everything else is roadmap hype. 3. How Nvidia responds, silence means confidence, rapid counter-announcement means panic. 4. What the major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, commit to deploying first, they control which silicon actually reaches market volume. The live updates from Taipei aren't finished. Day 2 and Day 3 will add more details on ARM-based processors, custom silicon from cloud providers, and manufacturing breakthroughs that extend Moore's law. But Day 1 already signaled the shift: the AI chip market is about to splinter. Nvidia's dominance is still absolute, but the end of monopoly is now visible. That matters for your portfolio, your startup decisions, and your understanding of where the next wave of compute leverage lies. Stay tuned to Computex coverage. This is the signal that drives the next quarter of tech spending. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.